Bhatia, and this is the class of BHIE 141, and we are going to cover in this class Unit 9 and Unit 10. As in Unit 9, we are going to cover the new cultural movement after 1911. After 1911, so many new cultural movements were held at that time in China. And if we are talking about culture, then we are going to think about Confucianism. Okay, Confucianism and traditional Chinese society, and the new cultural society which were developed when new philosophers and the ideas of philosophers, and what was the role of students and the new youth, and attack on tradition just like intellectual efforts. We are going to cover these points in unit 9. The objectives which we are going to cover in this unit 9, that hold of Confucian philosophy on China, reasons behind the advent of new culture after 1911. We are going to talk about the time period, that is 1911, after 1911, the components of new cultural movement, and the role of intellectuals in China's cultural revolution. Do you know who was Confucius and the ideology of Confucianism? The ideology of Confucianism had been practiced in China for more than 2000 years. However, a variety of factors led to the generation of such new ideas, such new ideas, just like which challenged not only the hold of Confucian ideology over the Chinese, but its very basis. The initial attempts for reform had been tried out very much within confines of Confucianism, with the exception of the Taipings, who had openly challenged and floated it. In this unit, we discuss the emergence of new culture in China after Revolution of 1911. Just we are going to cover about the new setting. What was the new setting in China at that time after 1911, when the end of a dynasty, the subsequent tyranny and disruptions were no new experiences for the Chinese people. Their ancestors had faced periods of massive anarchy at various intervals. They had not only come out of such situations, but at times had also flourished. For the Chinese, the dynastic circle was an accepted feature of history. The downfall of Qing dynasty in 1911 was a different thing. It brought it brought to an end the emperor system. According to the Chinese, the emperor, as son of heaven, was the supreme ruler and remained so till he lost the mandate of heaven. What that happens? A new ruler and dynasty takes over. The struggle to emancipate women, the growth of cities with their factories, the development of business enterprises, a new system of education were on the one hand destroying traditional Chinese society, on the other remaking it into a modern one. The political situations, the political revolution lay stagnant as military snatched power and curbed every attempt to create representation, constitution. The cultural revolution was on the increase. Confucian philosophy had remained secure and intact even though the monarchical dynastic emperor system, which had been there long before Confucianism had ended. The Confucian norm and harmony in society is achieved by maintaining a hierarchy and only through superior subordinate relationships. This was antithetical to any ideas of progress. The reformers of Manchu court during the 19th as well as in early years of 20th century tried to change China within the Confucian framework, and changes therefore were of not much consequence to Chinese society. They were largely superficial, and hence revolutionary change was simply not possible without challenging Confucian orthodoxy. Next is Confucianism and traditional Chinese society. How they both were connected with each other. The Confucian policy had maintained its hold on practically every sphere of life in China, even during what we term as the modern period. In Confucianism, the preference of age over youth, past over present, authority over subject, and society over individual is the norm. In other words, society is based on a hierarchy of relationships. As you all know, it is on the basis of this hierarchy that society maintains harmony and order. In the area of politics and government, if we are talking about political and government area, the Confucianism upheld rule by the virtues if the ruler himself did not follow ethical principles. How could he set things right in his kingdom? The political system was part of cosmic system and provided for enlightenment rule by a moral, ethical ruler, the emperor, son of heaven. They were saying at that time in China. It was done during the emperorship of China at that time. The subject was bound in obedience to the ruler, who was morally bound to rule over him and his other subjects. In the Confucian pattern of thinking, women were completely subordinated to men and youth to the older generation. Age and gender discrimination was so rampant in every strata of society that it was hardly noticeable. Women and no role in society. Woman had no role in society, and at home she was merely a wife or mother. Her role of childbearing, child rearing was seen as society's natural claim on her. Excluded from formal education, owning property, having access to productive resources, Chinese women for centuries suffered repression and oppression. Even in South China, where women performed agricultural tasks, their position in society or within the family was only marginally better than women in conservative North. Yes. As mentioned earlier, the youth were two in the category of oppressed strata. Youth. The tradition of PT demanded complete subordination of the younger generation to the older. Yes, according to Confucian teachings, the son's gratitude to father continue even after uh, the latter's death in the form of rituals, ceremonies done periodically, means month-wise, days-wise, month-wise, and year-wise. The ceremonies which were done by the son after the death of his father. This, to an extent, had kept China's young men submissive, timid, and weak. It hampered personal development and advancement. Even the family system had certain internalized forms of oppression which prevented an individual's free development. A vast portion of Chinese population was illiterate. They were not literate at that time in Chinese population. For millions, Education and learning remained the privilege of a tiny elite. The most important purpose of that education served was in the creation of social officials necessary for the imperial court to keep the Chinese nation under its constant control. The content of education was also very limited. It was confined to classics written in earlier periods. Committing the classics to memory was all that was expected to an educated person. The more one could cram, the more his intellectual capabilities were recognized. The civil service examination, through which officials were recruited, also considered memory as an indication of knowledge. The most unfortunate aspect of traditional Chinese system of education was that the written language was in literary or classical Chinese, which was very different from the spoken language. Spoken language by Hua. Mastering this language took several years of full-time study, and this was a great hindrance to the spread of literacy. And for the laboring people, it was next to impossible to devote that much time to education. Only the wealthy could afford it, and Confucian philosophy based on hierarchy and inequality implicitly supported this form of educational system. However, the survival of Confucianism as the reigning philosophy of China had been possible because if it had been successfully imposed on weaker section of society, whereas the powerful sections often violated it. The philosophy, in other words, was used expeditiously by the ruling classes. Yet, this order of things did not prevent social convulsions. It could no more keep China away from strife and violence. And next, our topic after education, the 1911 revolution and the new culture. The new culture which was going to start in China after the people were belonging were having the thinking of Confucius, and they were adopting the ideas and ideology and their philosophy in their daily life. The Chinese Revolution of 1911 has often been considered superficial for it produced no social transformation. Leave aside social revolution. Yet the fact remains that it brought about the following changes. Which changes they were bringing in the Chinese country, the China? What was that? The changes were number one, the end of universal kingship and the collapse of entire cosmology, which legitimized it. Number two, the fragmentation and militarization of power and authority throughout the society, often down to the local level. Number three, the loss of moral authority on many levels of that society. Number four, the concluding insecurity of local holders of power and wealth, both old and new. And last one is the failure of new republic to establish its own basis of legitimacy. That was the main reason for behind the 1911 revolution, and many of these trends had been underway much before 1911. The end of the examination system for the civil service had itself had an enormous effect on the social role of literate. The cosmology of kingship had already been undermined by the evolutionary doctrines of Kang Yue, Yan Fu, Liang Qichao, and others. Next is philosophers and their ideas. how philosophers entered into China and how they were spreading their ideas in front of the youth, in front of the public of China. The reformers, philosophers like Yan Fu, Kang Yuwai, now they felt confirmed in their conviction that evolution cannot be forced on a society, and that a republican revolution at this stage of China evolution was an enormous mistake. Liang Qichao accepted the revolution and the irreversibility of demise of monarchy as the decree of history. He was at first on thoroughly consistent grounds in favor of Yuan Shikai's efforts to a republican dictatorship which would be able to carry through the task of modernization. Kang, again, on thoroughly consistent evolutionary grounds, continued to believe that at this point only the symbols of monarchy could restore the center that had collapsed. A common tendency among all the three thinkers during this period was of a greater inclination to accept the premises of cultural nationalism. China, he argued, was still in a period of transition from a patriarchal to a military stage of society, and it still required a patriarchal faith. The responses of the active revolutionaries were diverse. They too demonstrated that their ideological commitments had not really been profound. Soon they got involved in the politics of unsavory warlord era. Sun Yat-sen tried to actively seek a base for political power. Those whose nationalism was primarily based on anti-Manchuism or the adherence of belief in national essence soon found that the Han race did not automatically achieve full restoration once the corrupt Manchus had been thrown out. Even those who were preoccupied with the preservation of national cultural identity could no longer hope that it might be preserved through political means. Next is the students. Earlier, we have studied about the philosophers and their ideas, how they spread their literary ideas and their ideology in front of the people. Next point is the student. Since the early years of 20th century, the number of students who had lived and studied abroad increased. Many had acquired education in the West and in Japan. Many young intellectuals were impressed by the Meiji Restoration in Japan. Western science, technology had been accepted by many as panacea for China's illness. All in all, there appeared on Chinese scene a group of people who were young, educated, politically conscious, socially aware, and progressive in their approach. The 21 demands hurt the pride and dignity of these people who reacted through a vociferous expression of nationalist sentiments. Yuan Shikai's attempts to restore monarchy had also worried them, though small in numbers but powerful in articulation. This strata led the May 4th movement, making anti imperialism as its basic plank on which rested the pillars of science, democracy, socialism. Let us also briefly mention about the Peking University, which was opened in China, the Peking University, Beida. That was established in 1895. The university started with a negative reputation. The faculty comprised of senior civil servants, students were from wealthy families, and whose primary aim was to get into the civil service at that time. Meaningful academic pursuit was of secondary importance. Faculty members' hierarchy was not dependent on their scholarship or teaching abilities but on their position in the Manchu court. The university was known more for its notoriety than its academics. The reform of Peking University was essentially the work of one man, Tsai Yun-pei. We can say Tsai Yun-pei and we can say Kai Yun-pei also. It's up to you. He had been educated in France and Germany, and also at a very early age, he passed the civil service examination. He was a man having the experience of two cultures. He quit the civil service and joined the revolutionaries in government of Sun Yat-sen in 1912, but resigned this post when Yuan Shikai became president. A few years later, the Peking government offered him a post of Chancellor of Peking University, which he accepted. Tsai was essentially an educationist, and his accomplishment as head of this institution earned him the distinction of being called the father of Chinese Renaissance. He appointed the best available scholars for faculty positions and next is he appointed the best available scholars for faculty positions, defended academic freedom from government pressure, and made the university a forum for free and open debate where students and professors were equally participants. Amongst the men he appointed to various faculties were Chen Duzi, Hu Shihan, Li Dazo. Two of them later became founder members of Chinese Communist Party. And with the help of Tsai's reforms, Peking University not only flourished academically but also became the center for debates and discussions between teachers and students and the intellectuals also. A group of new thinkers emerged and it won the student support, and together challenging the conservation of China, they called for modernization. And next, one reformer had said, Lucien Bianco, what he was telling, the May 4th movement was a youth movement in which professors in their 30s, their students, followers, sought with young men's passion to impose young men's values on their society. In addition to Peking University, the new culture movement was further developed and spread through the journal New Youth. And who was the New Youth at that time? Let's discuss about the New Youth. Another feature of intellectual and literary revolution was the publication of Sin Ching Nin or New Youth. Now we can say in other words, New Youth. And they were saying this word in Chinese language, Sin Ching Nin. The most spectacular and the most often noted aspect of this intellectual transformation, what was that? The literary revolution. The literary revolution was at first just the work of writers and the publicists. In January 1970, Hu Shi proposed that all writings here would be in the spoken language and not in classical Chinese. Who was saying this? Hu Shi. This was indeed a revolution in education as it made learning and knowledge accessible to more people. so that all people can read, all people can educate themselves. The living language was the only medium through which the common people could communicate. Hu Shi's proposal, which found favor among many intellectuals, had a social goal at that time. With literature becoming more accessible to people, Hu Shi also urged that what he was urging that time, it should be more directly concerned with people's lives. And this literary revolution, he felt, need not remain limited to linguistic reform that create new literature, new cares, and new styles. It was a new youth which first published Who She Viewpoint. This was formally endorsed by its editor, Chen Duzhei, who had founded the magazine in 1915 in Shanghai. Chen had got many leading anti established intellectuals join its editorial committee. Now, who was saying this? One example of its perspective tone in evident from Chen's six principles to be observed by the youth. Six principles. He said, be independent, not submissive, progressive, not conservative, outspoken, not reserved, cosmopolitan, not parochial, practical, not formalist, scientific, not imaginative. These six principles he was saying to principal to follow. These six principles. As reflected in its name, its influential magazine was all set to create a new youth. It called on all Chinese youth to be everything their parents were not, to be progressive, scientific, independent. It addressed itself to the young men and women educated in the new schools and in the new thought. Many of them had studied in Japan, in Europe, in USA. They had been exposed to the free exchange of ideas, Eastern and Western, old and new. They knew that 1911 had rid China only symbolically of the old officialdom or of authority, and that China was still an easy mark for imperialist power. The people felt that, as stated simply by Chen, the salvation of China lay in a new culture based on science and democracy. Science and democracy both. What he was saying, republican government in politics and science in the domain of ideas, these seem to be the treasure of modern civilization. It was through the pages of New Youth that Chen began his attack on Confucianism, and in early years of journal it advocated liberty, equality, fraternity, and the ideals of French Revolution. Next is attack on tradition and the intellectuals' efforts at that time. How the efforts of intellectuals were working at that time on China's tradition and characterizing the new culture movement as a whole. What we see on the other side is a much more radical, more totalistic attack on the entire cultural heritage. Chen's exhortations to the Chinese youth, like be independent, not survive progressive, not conservative, aggressive, and not passive. They were not attacks directly, simply against the entire tradition with all its three teachings of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. Three teachings, just like not to speak the superstitious culture of the masses. Although the language of social Darwinist evolution was being invoked, but in the same sense of old society and old culture began to be treated as if they had paralyzed the soul of nation. Now, here too, there seems to be only a difference of degree between the new youth outlook and the that of pioneer of thinkers. Between thinkers and new youth. In confronting their dilemma, the pioneers had come to stress the role of Confucian ideas in changing the society. They were taking the Confucius ideas in changing the society, yet their educational approach was supported by the sense that changes were actually taking place or about to take place in the institutional infrastructure of society during the course of Manchu reform system. The diagnosis of new culture group before 1919 led them to feel that nothing but a change of Confuciusness could move the society. Next, one aspect of new culture movement before 1919, which was to have continuing implications for the future, was the sharp line it draw between politicians and intellectuals. Sharp line between them. Another vital and crucial aspect of new culture movement was the emergence of new literature. Here also we see the emergence of literature as a major autonomous area of human experience. Next, even the romantic creation group of Guo Moro, Yu Dafu, and others, which had ostensibly adopted the slogan. What was the slogan? Art for art's sake. Art for art's sake was deeply moved by concerns which were not strictly artistic. Romanticism was as a release from the repressive structures of traditional life had emerged before 1911. Even when the promise of political salvation dramatically receded the concern of the younger intellectuals with the meaning of their own personal lives, in a word, with when their faith in traditional values, both public and private, had sharply declined, that was to become an important dimension of new culture. In a sense, individualism in both its liberal and romantic senses now seems to have a direct impact on personal life of a degree, which was certainly not true for the pioneer generation, who still lived quite comfortably within the confines of conventional Confucian family values. For a time, at least the concern with individualism as such seemed to be entirely instrumental to socio political goals. The translation of Ibsen's A Doll House in the Ibsen issue of New Youth, sponsored by Who She, is symbolic of this concern. In the words of Leo Lee, far from French symbolist notion that art not only restructures life but also constructs a new edifice into which the artist can escape life. Arguments point in the other direction towards an overriding concern with life. Next is another development clearly associated with the new culture movement is what might be called the higher criticism. Higher criticism of traditional heritage represented, among others, by the she. Conflicts regarding validity and authenticity of various traditions and scriptures. had been a feature of Chinese thought for ages. The great philosophical, the great philological scholars of empirical research, school of the Qing dynasty, had also fostered the critical treatment of great text. The movement to recognize the national heritage, as it was described by Hushi, had a deep ideological motive. The method of science could, in the words of Lawrence Skinder, be used to undermine the credibility of orthodox histories and the historical foundations of scriptures. One of the most effective ways of removing the dead hard of tradition was to dissolve the factual claims of the myths which supported that tradition. In the end, this critical liberation of historical studies from the burden of certain conventional ways of viewing the past was to be taken up by many other scholars of national studies. And next is there was the presumed scientific method of King's scholarship. The beginning of logic in China, ancient thought. In the case of Hushi, the vital vernacular literature of the past, which was in such striking contrast to the descendant formalistic classical literature of the elite. Despite of the shared premises of movement, when we juxtapose the names of some of its protagonists, Hushi, Chen Duzui, Lu Zun, we become actually conscious of profound differences among them. As a young student before 1911, who she had already been profoundly interested in and influenced by social Darwinist ideas of Yen Fu and Liang Qizhao. His happy experiences as a student in USA and his context with the philosophy of John Dewey then seem to have led him by a kind of smooth evolution to his own version of Chen Duzui famous formula, Mr. Science, Mr. Democracy. A formula which once it had been set forth was to remain essentially unchanged, and Yen Fu's conception of science as a kind of simple inductionism was to provide a bridge to Devi's experimentalist concept and who she is only life experience in early 20th century America was to provide him with a happy image of democracy in operation, even though he also enthusiastically accepted Devi's more advanced critical view of true democracy. In John Davies' philosophy, science and democracy were inseparable values. The experimental method of science, in its reliance on tentative hypotheses applied to the study of problematic situations, represented a rejection of all spiritual authority and all pre established dogma, whether religious, political, or metaphysical. That's why it was the very basis for the assertion of freedom. If man would cooperate together to apply the methods of science, which had been so successfully applied to the study of human cultural problems, an area still subjugated to the empire of dogma, the end of liberty, equality would be brought close to realization. Devi's emphasis on scientific intelligence and education was entirely in keeping with the whole new cultural emphasis on transformation of conscious life. It was that's why entirely appropriate then that when Hu Shi returned to China in 1917, he should have become closely associated with the movement. His deep interest in language reform was entirely in keeping with the broad educational goals of the movement. His interest in new literature reflected a deep and passionate fondness for literature and conviction that the effective power of literature provided a most powerful vehicle for communicating new ideas. When one surveys his life to retrospect, one cannot but feel that she is pronounced literally and scholarly concern reflected personal inclinations as well as the sincere belief that recognizing the national heritage. When we turn to Chen Duzui, we find that while he actually created the formula, what formula? Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy. His view of both these categories was different in subtle ways from that of Hushi. The fact that the Western influence, which had been predominant in his case, had been French rather than Anglo American, was not insignificant. Science was a corrosive which could be used to undermine traditional value. The fact that the forces of evolution seemed to have completely botched down in China led him to moments of deep depression. Yet, like Hu Shi, she was basically he was basically able to confine scientific determinism with a strong faith in the powers of an intellectual elite. Similarly, Hu Shi's conception of scientific method seems to have rendered him impervious to the appeal of nation of total revolutionary transformation. While Chen, who greatly admired the French Revolution as a fountainhead of modern democracy, was probably inherently more vulnerable to the appeal of revolutionary transformation in spite of his thoroughly anti political cultural approach during the period before 1990. During the period of close collaboration between the two, 1917 to 1919, there was nevertheless a great resemblance in their views on individual, on ingredients of democracy. Next is the consequences of May 4th incident. 4 May incident was saying that the new culture movement, which culminated in the May 4th movement, rather merged with it brought about multiplicity of doctrines which were to find expression in a myriad of new periodicals. May 4th, May 4th simply marked an explosive stage in the expansion of audience for the themes of new culture. New culture, particularly totalistic rejection of cultural heritage. One of the main consequences of these events here is their implications for the purely cultural diagnosis of China's ill. What was the China's ill? The May 4th incident was a political act, seemingly effective act of political protest against foreign. For a time, it was also a kind of mass movement. The new cultural leaders had in the past been mainly concerned with China's domestic ills. Their thought had not, on the whole, led them to moralistic judgments of the behavior of imperialist powers or to attribute China's ills primarily to foreign causes. Even the even a political Hushi was forced by the events of May 4th to reassess his posture. The immediate effect was to raise his hopes that the cultural transformation, which to his delight already seemed to have taken place among intellectuals, would flow not into politics but into a social movement. John Davy, who was himself in China in 1919, he encouraged this hope by his own observation that the students' organizations have gone into popular education, social and philanthropic service, and vigorous intellectual discussion. Who she spoke of masses of educate, movement to emancipate, social school to reform. The assumption of seems to have been at the outset that all these goals might be pursued while bypassing the intractable fact of political military power as they existed in China. The other sides of Hu Xin's political proposals were his calls for a government of good men, government with plan, already pointed to the gave problem of how to relate science to democracy in China, gave China's situation. He could only hope that man of scientific enlightenment might bring their influence to bear on established censorers of power. Sun Yat-sen and his entourage were on one of the groups better able to take advantage of nationalist political fervor which pervaded the young during May 4th. During the whole bleak period from 1911 to 1919, he had not been diverted from his politics goal of establishing a strong central government. However, in effecting his method, he did not give into the new cultural involvement with China's culture. On the contrary, even before 1911, he was convinced that national pride in the achievements of the past must be fostered, and he had even developed definite ideas of what was to be prized. During the years of growing bitterness after 1911, he had devoted a good deal of attention to the problem of how to create a disciplined, unified vanguard party in China. In general, his faith in constitutional democracy of type gradually Western type gradually declined. It is therefore not surprised that Sun Yat-sen and some of his closest disciples Sun Yat-sen and some of his closest disciples expressed an immediate and keen interest after the October Revolution in Lenin's view on party organization as well as the Soviet formula for dealing with military power. Some of his younger followers proved remarkably receptive to the Leninist theory of imperialism as an analysis of Western behavior. The Russian Revolution and its doctrine was one of the newer additions to doctrinal and philosophical storehouse of May 4th period. Lenin theory became gradually popular in China. A new breed among the intellectuals emerged as communists, spreading a new scientific culture through mass mobilization became their aim. This mass mobilization was to be a source of political and military power too. It need not be added that The new cultural perspective of period before 1919 was hardly oriented to mass political mobilization, however sincere its ultimate commitment to mass education might have been. In this period, 1911 to 1919, the Qing dynasty in 1911 and the May 4th incident of 1919 was marked. On the one hand, by political strife, economic instability, social tensions, but on the other hand, new culture was also emerging in the midst of this uncertainty and chaos. Uh, Probably this seemingly negative state of affairs brought about culture on the agenda of those seeking a better future for China. During the reform movements just like May 4th, reform movements during the debates, during the discussions and the controversies regarding the value and relevance of the Chinese-ness of China were commonplace. In this period, they concretized that into some definite ideological forms, reinvigorated nationalism, as well as the rise of communism were outcomes of this consolidation of viewpoints and discouraged streams of thought. Rejection of the past was not simply as sporadic and impulsive exercise. It was a result of untiring scholarly efforts. Whereas mass education was an important ingredient of the new culture, its near total reliance was on an enlightened elite, women's emancipation, youth power, political liberation, improving society were all crucial elements that combined to make China's cultural revolution. This pluralistic cultural academic movement, based on assumption of new ideas, gave the erstwhile Confucian China its severest jolt. More than half a century ago, Confucianism was challenged by the Taipings. Towards the end of 19th century, reformers of Hundred Days indirectly challenged Confucian tenets in the pretext of bringing out the real Confucians. Among the returned students, mainly from Japan and France, since the eve of World War one could see a fierce repudiation of Confucianism. This repudiation by a tiny elite gradually reached a large number of Chinese people who had access to education. It was accepted once for all that China's path to modernization had to be cleared of Confucian obstacle. We want Mr. Science, Mr. Democracy, and we reject Mr. Confucius and Company was a popular slogan of China's young intellectuals. For the first time, this all engulfing, all encompassing 2000 years old philosophy was challenged and trampled on the streets of Peking. Yes, the main and important role of the youth was what they accepting at that time and what they are ready to accept at that time. They had exclude Confucius theory, Confucius ideology from their society, and they had include Mr. Science, Mr. Democracy, and they reject Confucius and their company at that time. That was the main follow of the Chinese people at that time because the young generation were adding in Chinese population and they were thinking as they wanted to think. As earlier we have studied about 21 demands of Confucius at that time, and 100 days reformers of 100 days, and they directly challenged Confucian tenets in the pretext of bringing out the real Confucius. And we have done a lot of things related to the economical situation, the political situation, and the role of education at that time, and the role of young generation, what he was doing, they were doing at that time. Let us sum up this, and we will cover our unit 10 in our next class. And in unit 10 we will study about foreign investment and the rise of new class, how new class emerged with the foreign investment at that time in the history of China. Thank you and have a nice day.